So I'm just going to share my screen with you. Right, so welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. My name's Natalie. I'm doing my PhD currently at the University of Bath, and I live in Leighton Buzzard, so obviously part of, local to Bedford and in Bedfordshire. So what I want to talk about today is talking about food waste, really, and hopefully at the end we'll be able to have a really great discussion as well. So just the plan for the session. To begin with, I'll just do a brief introduction to food waste, a brief snapshot of my research so far and kind of the lessons I've learned as well from doing that. And then just a few things to think about, which will hopefully lead us nicely into the discussion where we can sort of have great question and answer and share thoughts and ideas of things to do really moving forward in terms of sort of tackling food waste as well. So just a brief introduction to food waste. Around 30 to 50% of food produced for human consumption goes to waste. And I mean, this is such a broad range of quantity of food waste just because it's so difficult to measure, especially kind of like on the farm side and, even within hospitality, like it's really, really difficult to actually get accurate measurements of how much is going to waste. In the UK, it's estimated to be around 4.5 million tonnes, the equivalent of 8 Wembley stadiums. Again, for me, like I find this, even when you kind of compare it to different things, it's still really hard to fathom how much is kind of going to waste. One of the UN sustainability goals is to reduce food waste by half by 2030. And there is still a long way to go on this. So food waste has various...
Oh shit, I'm sorry. How come?
So food waste has various social, economic and environmental impacts. So in terms of environmental impacts, it's a huge emitter of greenhouse gases, but there's also the environmental cost of land, water, transport and other resources that's used to produce the food that then goes to waste as well. In terms of social impacts, things like food security, food waste drives up the cost of food, making it even more inaccessible to people that need it. According to this 2013 data, food produced for human consumption is enough to feed 2.5 times the population. Yet, of course, there are so many people going hungry. And even obviously over the course of the pandemic as well, there was more and more people needing to access food banks and emergency food provision as well. And then in terms of economic costs, there's costs, for example, associated with managing landfills and transporting and segregating waste. And then on an individual level, the average UK household could save £60 a month just by reducing their food waste. So that just gives a brief sort of snapshot, an overview of some of the things that, some of the impacts of food waste. So how do we talk about food waste? So this was kind of the main sort of theme that came out of my pilot study for my research a couple of years ago. And it kind of led me on the current trajectory of where I'm at now with it. And what I'm going to go through now is some of my preliminary findings. So although my research is obviously focused on the hospitality industry, these are the sort of things that actually, just as consumers and individuals, citizens, and so on, that we could kind of, we can kind of learn from as well. So the preliminary findings about kind of effective ways to influence others to think about food waste in a certain way. This is so much easier to do this if the people that you're having the conversation with have sort of similar attitudes, values and identities to you, and they're kind of like this part of the same bubble. So, doing talks like this, for example, everybody that attends this sort of thing has obviously already got this kind of interest or values about food waste, sustainability and so on. So it's much easier for me to talk to you about this sort of thing than perhaps someone who is outside of that bubble. But of course, that's where the biggest challenge comes in, because those are the people that kind of need that greatest influence perhaps to make changes to their lifestyle and how they sort of tackle food waste within their own home, for example. And so in terms of like reaching outside of this bubble, again, this is so much easier if the person that you're talking to is open and has willingness to learn. And so this will, So this is kind of improved if you've got this sort of close proximity. So in terms of emotional closeness, if they're someone that you know really well, for example, then you can perhaps talk to them in the right way that perhaps might influence them to make some sort of change or to think about food waste a bit more. In terms of physical distance, one of the things I was finding in my research was there was quite a lot of examples about having direct communication with customers. So, if someone's at the counter ordering a cup of coffee or ordering some food, or they're sitting there at an open kitchen counter eating their meal, then they can have the sort of direct conversation about the food and where it's come from and how it's been produced and kind of what happens to it afterwards and this sort of thing. Whereas something like sharing a post on social media, although you might perhaps get response through likes and shares and comments and so on, you can't necessarily see the impact or the reach that might have had over influencing other people to think about food waste and change their behaviour. So it kind of leads nicely on to the next 2 points, which are about having the kind of tailored approach based on talking to a more of a wider audience. So with the tailored approach, using the appropriate language and method of communication to actually talk to someone about food waste, especially if you know them quite well, then this is much easier to do. So you can adjust the behaviour and communicate to them in a way that they will understand and that will get through to them. Whereas with the wider use audience, you kind of need to use multiple methods to increase that reach, and actually through using these multiple methods, you'll kind of create, you'll hopefully sort of resonate with someone in the right way. And then my final point here is about creating or negotiating an ideal environment for a conversation to take place. And so there's various examples that I could use here. But one of the things is about, there's always a right time and a place to have a conversation about things, and where it's going to have much greater impact. And so it's important to bear that in mind. And so, for example, within the hospitality environment, if you're sort of ordering food and talking about food, and you're already in this sort of food environment where you could talk about waste, but you need to do it in a bit more of a particular way rather than forcing it on someone as well. And so it's worth thinking about that sort of thing as well. So kind of just to sum up, what I'm kind of showing within my research so far is that by having sort of these conversations and talking about food waste, it helps people kind of notice what's going on and then makes them think about it a bit more so that they can actually then take action. So just a bit of a cheeky one here. So my data collection is still ongoing. So I just wanted to put here, if anyone does work in hospitality or knows someone who does that might be interested in doing an interview, please get in touch. They're around 40 to 60 minutes via Zoom or similar. And it's just about talking about perceptions and experiences of food waste and how you're influenced by others. And they're totally confidential as well. So moving forward, it's been, just doing these interviews and talking to loads of people has been really great as well, because I've learned so much from them and it's got me thinking about things in certain ways. And one of the things that's really come out of this is the things that I find particularly important in terms of tackling food waste. And these things are community, conversation, and reconnection with food. So in terms of community, it's kind of, food waste is this systemic problem. So collaboration and working together is such a big part of actually tackling the problem across the system. But then even on a more local level as well, community comes from just sort of having conversations with each other, sharing food with each other, sharing, surplus food, sharing recipes that might help someone use up a particular ingredient they're struggling to use up and things. So there's multiple levels, and I just think this is a really important element. And secondly, conversation. So as I mentioned before, it kind of brings things to the surface and makes it take note, makes others take note about food waste as well, so that they can actually make some motion in actually tackling it. And I also feel on a personal level as well, if you're talking to someone about food waste, you're kind of putting yourself on a pedestal a bit, and you've almost got to practice what you're preaching. So it makes you actually much more aware of what you're doing yourself. And then finally, reconnection with food. So although food waste is a systemic problem, if we think about it on a more of an individual level, where a lot of the issue comes in is that we're kind of not valuing food in the same way that perhaps we once did. And we haven't necessarily got this understanding of where it's produced and how it's grown, or how to cook with a particular ingredient and things like this. And so although food is this basic need, it also goes far beyond this, and it's a very, very social need as well, you know, linking back to community, for example. And I think one of the things that came across a lot of my interviews as well was so many people talked about enjoyment, food and enjoyment, and that even in terms of food waste, if someone did not waste food, if they took food home with them, or if they were able to take food home at the end of the day that hadn't been sold, it made them feel good. And I think that was a really important point as well, is, you know, it just makes us feel so much better that the food's not going in the bin. So I hope what I've said so far is kind of giving you a few things to think about. I've got a few other things here. So last week I attended a symposium about the future of food, and it gave me so much food for thought, and so many different things that sort of need to think about as well that might make good discussion points. So one thing is around what is food waste, and this is something that I kind of try and get at quite a lot in my own research, is sort of what does food waste mean to you? Like, it's the first question I ask all my participants, and to me it's really important so that you understand kind of what that you perceive to be valuable, what you perceive to be edible, and you know, what you perceive as waste and then for dispose of, you know. And addressing all these things means that you can kind of address what you're throwing away as well, because you're thinking about, well, actually that is edible, so I could do something with it, rather than just going, I haven't got the time, I'm just going to chuck it away, for example. Secondly, like food waste in relation to other sustainability issues. So I find one thing I find really interesting about food waste is like the intersection it has with a lot of other sustainability issues, which I'm not sure some do in quite like other issues have in quite the same way. You know, if you think about you know, you can't always talk about food waste without talking about packaging waste, or you can't talk about food waste without talking about food poverty and things like this. And so I think the conversation around food waste also, it can't happen in a silo just focusing on food waste. There's other things that need to be considered at the same time. So one of the things that was talked about quite a lot in this symposium last week was the role of digital platforms in preventing food waste, you know, and there's a growing number of apps, for example, that focus on food sharing, whether it's on like a household level or between businesses or between business and consumer. And this is definitely a growing area of interest. And it kind of expands the sort of idea we have about sharing food as well, because in some cases it can be reciprocal, in others it might just be one directional, and it also goes beyond food and thinks about things like sharing knowledge and resources, and it also addresses kind of the access to food and affordability and access to healthy food as well. So linking back to sort of communities as well, is that building partnerships with other people as well. And learning from the past, looking to the future. So something that I've always been quite interested in, and actually there was a couple of people talking about it last week in relation to the food programs during World War II in terms of, sort of rationing and Dig for Victory campaigns and things like that, is actually what lessons can we learn from the past that we can kind of borrow from, or perhaps say, well, this didn't work, so we'll avoid doing that again. So it's really important to actually look back and see what sort of things had worked and what didn't, and see if that's anything we can borrow for the future. So I think that's always an interesting thing to think about. And then personal experiences of talking to others about food waste. So one thing that I've found throughout my PhD is obviously as soon as you tell someone that you're doing a PhD, they'll always ask, what's it about? And having the topic that I do, it's one of those things that people seem to be able to relate to, and they understand what you're actually doing, and it always sparks a conversation. And then finally, which might be a good starting point for a discussion as well, is what would you like to get out of this session? So thank you for listening, and I hope we can have a great conversation. Any questions that or comments or thoughts you have, I mean, write them in the chat or stick your hand up, whatever you feel most comfortable with. Thank you. Right, I hope you could hear me okay.
I think Lucy, did you want to answer Lucy's one?
Let me just get the chat box up. The school I'm governor at has just taken catering in-house. Good news, but I want to see how that can make a difference to reducing food waste. Any ideas beyond food composting? Ooh.
It's a difficult one, Natalie, because they've made the school or they've got increased uptake since they've taken it in-house just this term. Okay. Something they'd wanted to do for a while. It's quite a big task for the school, as you can imagine, for various reasons, including staff shortages at the moment, which we're having across the board. So it's something that very new for the school. So I don't want to sort of leap in on them too quickly and be critical of them. But I've noticed from the food ordering system, there's a lot of spontaneity and flexibility allowed, which is great for hard-pressed kids and parents and people who forget to order and they forget packed lunches. But it means inevitably, like with hospitality, doesn't it, that there'll be over-producing of meals, I'm guessing, on most, if not all days. And I don't know if you have any experience of how to manage that, or is there any solution if you're trying to be spontaneous and flexible?
I think so. Is it, I mean, what sort of level education is it? Do they have
it's an all through school, so
okay.
It's primary, it's nursery actually, up into 16.
Wow.
2 sites, yeah, 2 sites. It's quite a busy,
yeah, that's huge.
Yeah.
So do they have the options where they can, where it's just set meals each day, or do they have little things they can pick and mix at, if you know what I mean?
They have some choice, so they do have vegetarian option, for example. Yeah, I think I'm not sure actually if they have sandwiches. It's something I want to talk to the head about soon. We had a governor's meeting last week and I didn't want to, we had such a busy meeting, I didn't want to take it over because of COVID. COVID is picking up, and GCSEs, they've just done their first year of GCSEs. But I'd sort of made notes that I wanted to go back to the head and just say what sort of issues are they going to be because of this new extra flexibility. The previous contractor, as far as I could gather, were less flexible. Understandably, they'd say, right, you need to order your meal by this time for next week, otherwise, you know, you've lost the chance to, you know.
Yeah, I know at my son's school, so one of them, you know, you have to order every half term what they're going to do each day, whether it's cold meals, hot lunches or packed lunches. And then the other son, it's one of those ones where they can just go in on the day and spend what, you know, buy what they'd like on the day. So there's a much more flexibility from the school's part on that. I guess that's obviously going to have a lot greater impact compared to the other one. I think my personal experience is I did used to do some nursery catering, which was they had sort of so many for breakfast each day, so many for lunch, so many for tea, and then 2 snacks throughout the day. They had a lot of food and the numbers fluctuated a little bit during the day if someone ended up getting picked up early. The portion size is, I think, the biggest issue. Because I think portion sizes were far too big. So that's probably the key thing to address that. in terms of it's always difficulty having that flexibility. I think, and I think as well, like students are customers in the same way as customers going to a restaurant where you've got to have that choice of menu, because those kids coming in right at the end of the day are going to not be happy if they've only got one thing left choice wise all the time. I think based on experience and some of the people I've talked to, one way around that is almost to have a kind of overlapping menu, in that if you get to the kind of the last lunch intake on Monday, have that second, third option of meal that would then be the first option on Tuesday, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so that's one potential way around it. But yeah, I mean, composting, like you comment, beyond food composting, I mean, composting is always a great thing, especially for like the younger kids, to get involved in that and make them think about it a bit more. So from an educational point of view, I think something like food composting is a really good thing in schools.
The school is lucky that they've got a member of staff called Chef, because he can cook up anything, but he's not the chef actually. He's a sort of forest school leader, so he works with special needs children outside and growing stuff and building sheds and just doing incredibly imaginative stuff with them outside. But he's very interested in this issue as well, luckily. And he also cooks. He knows a lot about food. So I'm hoping between us we can kind of, but yeah, thanks for your input.
All right. And I suppose the other thing as well is getting some of the students on board. So if they've got class representatives or even special class representatives from each year group, because I think that would make, you know, they'll have a lot to say as well, and probably things that other people won't have thought about.
That's a good point. Yeah, school council, and there's an eco club as well now. So yeah, between them, that's a good point. Thank you.
Comment from, oh sorry, I can't speak. Comment from Avril, have you looked into practical methods of quantifying food waste and which types of foods are being wasted comparatively, please, in the catering session? Something of interest to me, and also translate from a nutritional perspective. So there's been a lot of research on quantifying food waste in sort of hospitality and food service. So I mean, probably around half the literature in that field actually focuses on that sort of thing. And then there's also non-academic reports, like particularly from RAP, that attempt to quantify it. So sort of off the top of my head, the RAP statistics in the UK are around half of it comes from consumer plate waste, and then the other half of it comes from back of house in the kitchen, so think through things like spoilage and preparation waste, and then also things like you know, kind of like buffet serving type waste as well. Similarly to consumers and households, hospitality food waste, the dominant ones are things like sort of potatoes and rice and bread and that sort of thing. And then sort of beyond that, it's a lot of the things like the sort of the little added extras and stuff like that that tends to be wasted quite a lot. Whereas things like meat and the high value ingredients tend to not have quite as high waste. And I think part of that is because businesses are a lot more conscious of those sort of things not going to waste because it costs them a lot more money to buy. But yeah, definitely things like potatoes, bread and things like that are the higher wasted items. Again, sort of fruit and veg, so anything that's got shorter perishability. So from a nutritional perspective, obviously being your background, Avril, can you expand on that in terms of sort of quantifying food waste and things?
Do feel free to unmute yourself.
Or place an additional comment. I mean, I think there's, I mean, there's been a bit of crossover as well with some of the sort of nutritional research, particularly in terms of plate waste. So about sort of what goes to waste on from consumer plates and the sort of the proportions of that sort of thing. So it's very similar as well. And there's various sort of suggestions about, you know, the sort of the size of the plate that you use, and even like the shape and color, and there's sort of various different ways of almost making something more, you know, looking like it's more even though it's less. Has anyone got any other sort of questions or thoughts or things that they'd like to share?
Just one thing, I think I might have mentioned this before actually, because I heard you speak before, and there was there's a cafe in Bedford called Green Earth Cafe. Mm-hmm. It is incredibly thoughtful and sustainable, and really it's not just, it's one of the few examples that's not greenwash. They mm-hmm. do everything by the book sustainably, and they so when they run out, they have a wonderful menu, it's all vegan, and when they run out of something, you know, they run out. So they run out of things every day, and that's just, you know, the way it is. But Rachel, who runs the cafe, said sometimes people are quite irritated because they're not used to that. They're used to having endless choice and things being whipped out the freezer, whacked in the microwave or whatever. And so it's quite a difficult thing for her as a business to get beyond, because obviously her competitors, it's very rare for them to say we've run out of something. I personally always think it's a good sign when someone says that, because I think it's fresh and they're not wasting food. But have you come across that sort of tug between different businesses of where one is providing endless choice, endless everything, and the other one's trying to, in terms of hospitality, trying to, you know, be sustainable? But, you know, it's a hearts and minds thing, isn't it? How do you win over people to accepting less choice and therefore less waste, really?
Yeah, I think that's something that you do see quite a lot of. And I think what's been quite interesting over the period of time I've been doing the research is that because of COVID, a lot of places are streamlining their menus, and they're almost using COVID as a bit of an excuse to actually streamline their menus and to say, well, we've run out of this, so we can't do anything about this. And I think that's, although I haven't spoken to anyone recently, following, you know, all the issues, the supply chain issues and lorry driver shortages and things like that, again, I feel like that's something as well that's going to be kind of, in one way, used a bit as an excuse, and then and the second way kind of used as an opportunity to actually kind of almost get it into that customer mindset that actually you're not going to have the whole range available all the time. So there's pros and cons around it. Avril's got a hand up.
Did you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, she has just put in the chat about internet connection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello, yeah, I'm awfully sorry. As it happened, turned out that actually on holiday today, and I'm in a National Trust property. They've been very helpful, but just in the middle of, I'm sort of sitting in a corner somewhere, but just in the middle of you answering my question, I got disturbed because they needed to move a seat next to where I was, and then I lost the connection, so I'm sorry I couldn't answer. And it took me a little while to get fully connected again. I could hear what you were saying, but that was all. So thank you very much for the response. I mean, I was looking for specific methods which can be used then for nutritional analysis, because I do quite a lot of work in the public and the private sector, and that includes places like care homes, for example. And it's trying to sort of assess the plate waste and that kind of thing and separate things out and then translate that into nutritional improvements. But I mean, I know some of it's not very exact, but even if it's not exact, it does help.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the most difficult things from the kind of practical perspective is obviously getting staff to separate food waste.
Yeah.
And, you know, especially if it's in a very busy environment and they've got their sort of habits and routines and things, it's kind of working that into the routines of what they do. But there's certainly various ways. I mean, you know, one of the things is sort of making sure that you've got the sort of separate bins.
Yes, yeah. Well, we have tried doing that, because some of the work I do is actually between me and a nutritionist who is based in a particular, in fact, it's a nursing home where she works. So we've been looking at that, and we've reviewed all aspects of food supply and suppliers, and really try to look at it quite holistically, so to cut down on plastic waste, to reduce food miles, etc. But particularly to try to reduce food waste both in the kitchen and at the table.
So yeah, I mean, sort of separate bins, actually sort of monitoring it and keeping a note of what is coming, you know, what is being thrown away. That's not always so easy from the kind of the plate waste side of things, but one of the things that is done over, you know, you don't want to obviously necessarily do it every day, but if you're taking, say, a week where you're going to even just
it becomes like quite laborious, and it's also quite difficult for staff to do, but the nutritionist is able to do some of this herself, but also some of it needs help from other people. So we've kind of been using information from other studies where we can, but trying to refine it to suit the situation that we're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the thing, is finding the way that works best for you, and that's the biggest difficulty, especially in sort of hospitality care, schools, and anything like that, is they're all so different, and it's not something that you can do every day necessarily, and you know, you just need maybe sort of one person that sort of takes some time out and focuses on that perhaps, and even just things like taking photos of plates when they come back, so that you can almost compile the outside of the craziness, you can kind of have a look back, see
do a sort of rough assessment, because I mean, we are quite good at looking at portion sizes and translating those into approximate weights, and then we can do some more refined nutritional assessment on that data. That's a good idea, actually. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I mean, just while I'm on the line speaking to you, another concern that we've had more generally is about the food supply chain and distribution, which has actually been causing quite a lot of waste at the farm and growers end, because, you know, some of the crops have not been getting shifted, and then it further down the chain affects the supplies on the supermarket shelves and so on and so forth. And this isn't really helping from a food insecurity point of view. And that's another area I'm involved with separately to the care home work. But personally, I don't really feel that the government has taken all of this seriously enough. And the food growers and farmers were actually speaking about the lack of HGV drivers problem weeks and weeks ago, while crops were just going to waste in the field because they couldn't shift what they got. So it's not really helpful. So I think we do need to get government on board more, probably do more lobbying and things like that. But I did try, and I didn't really get anywhere. You know, I tried the Mayor of West Yorkshire. We didn't have an MP at the time, but I didn't even get a reply. So that was a bit of a dead end. But we have to be persistent, as you said, don't we?
Yeah, yeah. I think the persistency is a key thing, especially for that sort of thing where we've kind of not got the same. We haven't got any control over it ourselves. It's what do we do to actually push that? And yeah, because there's so many things that are coming out, and about the, you know, and farmers being told to pour milk down the drain, and
I mean, it's just it goes against everything that, you know, is supposed to be happening from a policy point of view, doesn't it? I mean, that's the reality at the end of the day. It's just really crazy. Doesn't make sense.
What you'd said that you'd been doing something outside of work to sort of help. Have you been doing, is that some sort of volunteering?
No, I mean, it's all part of my work, but outside the care home work, because I work freelance. So I'm public health nutritionist and a dietitian. But there's a fair bit of overlap actually between what the nutritionists and dietitians do. So I cover that anyway, because, you know, I'm coming at it from both perspectives. But it's that part is really separate. It relates to, but it's separate from the work that I've been doing with the nursing home. But you know, I attend meetings sometimes where there are representatives from people who are food growers and farmers, and you know, they were getting very, very concerned early on about this situation and coming up with some quite good ideas, I think. You know, and people are saying, well, why can't the army help? Because they got plenty of big lorries and plenty of people with HGVs and licenses, but you know, it just wasn't happening, and the government didn't seem to even want to listen. I mean, it's got more into the news now, so you know, it's not as fresh a subject perhaps as it was back then, but you know, I've sort of been through the whole process, and it goes back a lot further than when it got into the media. And I do feel that we don't get enough, well, the government's not proactive enough in the first place, but they aren't even reactive enough. They're far too slow in dealing with these things. And in the meantime, a lot of food's going to waste, and yet we've got people who, you know, can't afford to buy food. They're having to depend on food banks and so on. So yeah, it just seems a very disconnected situation that we're in.
I mean, it addresses the sort of systemic issues that we've had,
absolutely,
even before this anyway. And I think it also, you know, it raises that question that, you know, there's what we can do as individuals in our own home and in the businesses we work for, but then it's what can we do on a broader scale? And I mean, that's one of the questions that, you know, I never know what to do beyond what I'm doing. Like me doing my PhD is my own little kind of bit of activism almost. Like that's just my way of sort of trying to tackle the problem. So I don't know, any thoughts, any recommendations would be great.
Yeah, well, I think we do have to keep targeting policy, but I mean, we've got the National Food Strategy, but although it's got some good points to it, I'm not entirely happy with how it's been dealt with. And I do think it's a shame that more nutritionists and dietitians weren't involved directly in it, because we've got a lot of experience at the public interface of dealing with such issues, and they're not really making use of our expertise, but then they're not employing enough people to do those sort of things. You know, the jobs just aren't there. So there are lots of faults in the system. But, you know, I suppose we have to be resilient and just keep doing what we can. But sometimes I feel, you know, we're making all these efforts and they're only on the scale of things quite small, but they do add up. But then big things can go wrong, which really undermine all the efforts that we're making. So it becomes a bit frustrating at times. But I'm not giving up on it anyway. We've got to keep going, haven't we?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks. I'm sure other people might want to have a say. I mean, I can continue talking till the cows come home if you want me to, but I want to let someone else have a chance to contribute. Thanks. I'll come back if you need me.
That's all right. Well, thank you. Thank
Thanks.
you. Thank
Thanks.
you. Does anyone else have any comments and things that they'd like to add? I mean, I suppose my question as well, leading off of that, is sort of what's recommendations do people have for actually kind of addressing the wider issue and the sort of the systemic problems, you know, in terms of contacting people in government or doing things on a wider level? Does anyone have any recommendations?
Working with,
yeah, I have some, but you know, perhaps somebody else wants to speak first.
Go ahead, Avril.
Okay, right. Well, I mean, it's already come out in some of the things that you've said, but collaboration is extremely important. And the more that we work together and support one another, then the more influence we can have. And we need to particularly focus on the public interface and engage people in what we're trying to achieve. And that isn't always easy, because people's lifestyles and so on don't always lend themselves very easily to these sort of changes, but there are inherent benefits for everybody if they reduce food waste. And we all need to be involved in it, and each and every one of us can make a contribution. But at the higher level, I think, you know, we have to keep pushing to make sure that food policy implementation follows the right kind of strategy and seriously considers issues such as food waste, food insecurity, and the resulting health inequalities that are related to food insecurity, which has grown considerably since the pandemic.
I think Avril couldn't have put it better, actually. I think she's made really good points. It's really good to have her expertise as well added to yours, Natalie. I think food insecurity obviously is going to be increased, you know, with the Brexit situation and all of the complications.
Yeah, there have been a lot of factors that have come into play, unfortunately, more or less all at once, and obviously have made matters even worse.
Yeah.
But
and also,
I think the only good thing from that is it has raised awareness. There's a lot more awareness of that now than there used to be. And I mean, that some of that's been helped by certain celebrities and so on. And sometimes they can actually have a lot more influence on government than the professionals seem to have. So we probably need to work with and through people like that at times as well.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking of people like Marcus Rashford.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm thinking about the issues around climate crisis as well. So
yeah, absolutely, it's all interrelated.
And pushing food prices up and affecting crops. Yeah,
absolutely, it's only going to make matters worse. And then, I mean, added to that, we're going to have more people to feed as well, because the population keeps increasing. So it's a bit of a gloomy picture, really. It can be really a bit depressing if you start thinking about it in too much detail. But I think, you know, it is something that we can change if we make the effort now, but it's urgent. We can't, you know, just sort of keep ignoring it, or sort of, you know, take the greenwashing approach. And I think that needs to be exposed and outlawed, because, you know, it's not right, and it happens in so many different ways. And to prevent that, I mean, I think perhaps there may be some people who do it slightly innocently because they haven't really looked at things holistically, but they do need to take an holistic view of what's going on, because if they're only thinking about food waste per se, just in itself, they might be ignoring other factors like plastic waste from packaging, and some of the greenhouse gas effects and carbon emissions and so on. It is quite complicated, but you've got to look at it holistically, because otherwise it gives a false impression. And unfortunately, I think some of the large companies have been doing that on purpose, because they want to promote the good things that they are doing, but they try to cover up the other things that they're not doing.
I think, yeah, the big companies are so difficult as well. I think one of the things that I sort of realised with talk to through doing my research is that you kind of end up with someone like a sustainability manager in the company that's obviously been forced into that position because they need to be shown they're doing something.
Yes.
And of course,
yes.
they've got that kind of that expertise and that passion towards that subject, and they're trying to actually instill it among the institution first, let alone actually trying to get it out to what the actual business is doing. They've actually got such big work on their hands that they've got to get it throughout the organisation as well.
Yeah, well, this is where the other sort of aspect comes in, which I didn't really make explicit, but that's a whole systems approach, because if you don't look at the whole system, things get overlooked, and then quite often what's happening is flawed. And it's more difficult to do that, but it's the only way really to get it right. And, you know, that's something that we as public health nutritionists and dietitians have been doing for quite a long time, because for example, we've spoken about the work that goes on in schools, and there are some excellent examples of schools addressing these sorts of issues, and also promoting healthy eating in a very holistic sort of way. But what we've always tried to help schools to do is take a whole school approach, so to include nutrition in the curriculum, make the children aware in terms of the food that they're eating in school dinners, look at packed lunches, engage them in growing food, eating the food that they've been growing in the school if they can, if they've got the facilities, getting the parents involved. Everybody, you know, to do with the school needs to be involved in some way or other. And the more people that you get involved, then the more they actually achieve, and I think the more interested they get as well. And with children, obviously, if, you know, they sort of start doing it young, it's something they can take forward with them as they grow up, because they get in the habit of doing it. Breaking bad habits is quite difficult, but so it's better to create good habits in the first place if we possibly can. Absolutely. And that's an example for schools, but it needs to be applied really across the whole of the food supply chain, and across people's eating habits and behaviours too, which is a big ask. But you know, if we don't do that, then we're going to miss out on things, and it's going to make it more difficult to achieve what we're setting out to achieve.
I mean, I think that's a really good point though as well. Like, schools are such a great place to start with that sort of thing, because you're not only getting to the children, but you're getting to the sort of the members of staff, you're getting to the parents, families as well. So it's got that kind of knock-on effect that hopefully would then kind of knock on even further into their real work.
Yes, yeah.
Colleagues.
Well, I've directly been involved in some of those projects, and not at the moment doing that, because, you know, there's a limit to what I can do. But in Leeds, we had a healthy passport for school meals. That was a few years ago, and we rolled that out across the whole of Leeds. To all the caterers, because there were different suppliers depending on the individual schools, and we also worked with the staff, and we worked with the caterers, and then the staff sort of rolled that out to the children and the parents and so on. And there were some amazing examples of things that they came up with. You know, we sort of gave them the basis, and then we asked them to do various tasks to think about how they could actually implement these things and ideas within the school. And I think, you know, it can spread to the whole community if it's done right. But it needs funding, and that's one of the problems we've got at the moment, because at the moment there isn't so much funding for these sort of things, and there should be. You know, it should be a priority. So that's another thing I think that perhaps requires more work with local and central government to get the funding to do some of these things, because they really, it's a win-win situation if it's done properly. But if it's neglected, then sometimes, I mean, unfortunately in my area, what often happens is there'll be so much funding for a project, it goes ahead, it does well, it gets evaluated, but then the funding runs out and then it stops. And, you know, we sort of end up going back to almost where we were before we started. Not completely, but, you know, it should be longer term than that. So that's another snag that we have in reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Just actually making an initiative or the things embedded in the system and making them sustainable in themselves is, I think, probably almost a bigger issue in some ways, to kind of have that consistency with it. Thank you so much for everything that you've said, Avril. That's been great, and I think it's probably added quite a lot to what you were saying at the beginning, Lucy, as well, about everything that's you're trying to do at school, and it's actually all kind of fitted in quite nicely. So I hope that's been helpful for you on a lot of fronts there. Does anyone have anything else to add just before we kind of finish off?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's been really interesting.
Thank you, everyone, for taking part. And Corey for having us. Bye.
See you soon.